We're very pleased for a series to host today, taught by Susanne Wengle, who is professor of Russian and Eurasian studies at Uppsala University in Sweden. She's the author of two books, post-war post-Soviet power, state-led development in Russia's Marketization, and more recently, Black Earth, White Bread, a technopolitical history of Russian agriculture and food, which leads into the project I think going to be talking to us about today. Welcome.
Thank you, Eugene. Thanks everyone for coming. It's nice to see everyone and see everyone in the Thanksgiving week. I apologize for making you come here on this Monday, but I have a couple of things to share about. Oh, here's the signal's gone. Sorry. About one aspect of the Russian-Ukrainian war that is less well known. So my broader research agenda is the post-Soviet market transition. So I study how post-Soviet countries created market institutions after the collapse of the planned economy in '91. And I have looked in more detail at energy and electricity, and for the last 8 or so years, as Eugene said, looked at agriculture. So because I have this interest and background in agriculture, when the war started, we paid attention and tried to document the damage the war has wrought on Ukrainian agriculture. And I want to introduce my two co-authors and give credit to their work. It's Vitaly Dankevich from Politkovskaya National University in Shitomir and Natalia Mamonova, who is at a think tank in Norway. So I couldn't have done this work without them, especially without Vitaly, who is in Ukraine and is collecting evidence, but also without Natalia, who's an expert on East European rural politics. So what I want to talk about first is the war damage, and then we'll try to understand not only what is going on right now, but what might explain what is going on, and put the current damage in historical perspective of Soviet-era agriculture, and then Ukraine's post-Soviet agricultural boom. And then finally, I want to try to draw some conclusions what this historical perspective might help us understand about the ongoing war. So since Russia's invasion of Ukraine started in February 2022, farms have been very significantly affected. We have documented 4 types of damage, and this is actually a classification we came up with in the first months of the war, and it has held up quite well. So the first one is theft. The second one is the disruption of the growing season. Now we have 2 growing seasons and 2 harvests actually, and then the third one is damage to infrastructure, and the fourth one is the naval blockade. So these different types of war damage have different long-term and short-term effects on the Ukrainian economy and the Ukrainian rural society.
Just as a question, if the field is burned, or if there are troops in the field, is that number 2 or number 3?
I will. It's on my list, number 2. So let me talk just a little bit more about each of these types, because we've actually we came up with the classification over a year ago, and the categories have sort of filled in over time. And so I'll tell you a little bit more what each of these categories are. So the first one is theft. So initially we saw a lot of media reports on grain theft. So Russian troops in the occupied territory would just take the grain and leave with it. And the same was true for agricultural machinery. And one thing about agricultural machinery is that we might think of it as sort of an old tractor. I think she has a picture of an old tractor here, but these are, because Ukraine has invested heavily in agriculture, these are really technologically sophisticated and expensive pieces of equipment. So this is stealing a tractor is actually a big blow to a farm. It's a big deal. So it's all different kinds of theft. It's grain, it's machinery. I also recently heard about the theft of all equipment at an agrochemical fertilizer factory. This is a company called Azot. It's a fertilizer plant in Luhansk and Severodonetsk, and apparently the occupying troop just took all the machinery and moved it across the Russian border. It also concerns actually theft of land. So there's land legal processes going on where Russian occupying troops are changing the ledgers or trying to change the ledgers to write Russian owners into the Ukrainian cadastre. And this is sort of contested, and we don't know what's happening with the land claims. One thing to add on the grain. So what we knew so far is that grain was taken from fields over to the Russian border and shipped through Russian ports. Recently, actually, it was, I think on Tuesday of this week, there's a report by a Ukrainian NGO that came out that claims that this grain theft was not only was large scale and pre-planned. So what they did, what we didn't do, we just looked at media reports. What they did is look at satellite images of train carriages leaving the occupied territories in 22 and also 23, and they basically tracked the Russian rail carts, the RZD, and distinguished them from the Ukrainian trail carts. And they also documented grain storage on the other side, on the Russian side of the border. So all of this is quite significant. The second category, the disruption of the growing season, had more immediate effect on the economies of Russian farmers. It became really difficult to farm for Ukrainian farmers because all the inputs for farming were really expensive. So energy is one of the key inputs, fertilizer, that were largely imported from Russia and Belarus before the war. There's also labor shortages because a lot of rural residents were at the front or abroad. The category of mines, a lot of Ukrainian fields along the border are now mined. It's becoming really, it's becoming clear that it's just very expensive to demine. It's very unclear who will do the demining. A lot of Ukrainian farms are trying to demine their own fields, and that is actually really dangerous. So we also see media reports of farmers getting hurt and killed. And here's arson. That was at the end of the growing season. The Russian occupying troops, which is their foreign whatever crops was left. The third category is damage to infrastructure. This is most likely the category of damage that has the greatest long-term damage. And this is also actually what we see mostly in the US news, right? It's Russian bombs destroying port infrastructure, storage infrastructure, irrigation systems, the port infrastructure on rivers as well, not just on the Black Sea. So this adds up to the most sort of significant monetary damage. There's two categories that I mentioned specially because I think they're especially destructive. One is the Kakhovka Dam, the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, and the Zaporizhia region and the Kherson region, the left bank, Zaporizhia and left bank Kherson were heavily reliant for water from the Kakhovka reservoir for their irrigation infrastructure. So the destruction of the dam basically destroyed the agricultural potential of that region. And then the Ukraine's national gene bank was bombed really early on in the war, which again obviously has huge long-term implications. The naval blockade is sort of its own can of worms, its own type of damage. And here too is interesting. I've presented this work for a few months and actually over a year now, and this actually picture here has evolved quite a bit. The basic fact is that almost all of Ukrainian grain was exported via the Black Sea. So the geography of Ukraine looks like there's a bunch of rivers, so the grain comes down on barges through the rivers and then is exported to global markets. For the first 6 months, exports were largely stalled due to the Russian naval blockade. Then the grain corridor allowed for some grains to be exported for about a year between July 22 and July 23. However, it was always politically tenuous, and Russia had always imposed conditions as leverage over the Western sanctions regimes. So it was always not a permanent solution. What we have now is that Ukraine has unilaterally declared a corridor, a safe corridor in the Black Sea. So some grain ships have left, sort of hugging the coast towards Romania, and then exiting through the Bosporus. However, Russia has always threatened those ships, and there's actually sort of a fight over naval preponderance in the Black Sea going on that I can talk more about, but I won't right now.
Sorry, what is this map showing?
Sorry.
Purple.
This is basically the Russian naval blockade. Those are the territories that Russia held in the first 6 months, but thank you. Yeah, so there's the Black Sea is a really interesting site of the conflict, and I think it's often sort of was under emphasized because people were sort of looking at the front, moving back and forth, but the Black Sea is quite important for this story. So all of this together adds up to very, very significant damage to Ukraine and to Ukrainian agriculture. So the FAO estimated that there's about 4 million damage to agricultural enterprises. So that's billion. Sorry, what did I say?
You said million.
Gosh, almost 4 billion to Ukrainian agricultural enterprises. And this is sort of now also an outdated figure. I'm sorry that I don't have a more recent one. And the Kiev School of Economics has a center that is also collecting information and trying to quantify this damage, and they are quantifying the damage to the agricultural sector as a whole at around $40 billion. In the words of one of the main agricultural companies, Nibulon, the war has seriously disrupted our business. Large areas of agricultural production are in occupied territories. We do not have access. We are not able to use our shipping fleet because of the blockage of the seaports, and we're rerouting exports via land routes, which is much more costly. So this is just one voice, but it gives you a sense of just how destructive the war has been for farms.
I need to interrupt you. Can
Yes.
you go back to that slide?
Yeah.
That's one voice, but unfortunately, that man was killed by a Russian missile.
His father was killed. It's
Oh,
Andre.
that's
Yeah.
his son.
Yes.
Okay.
I know. So Steve knows his father, actually.
I knew his father.
You knew his father, yeah. It's a very prominent actor. Nibulon is a very prominent actor in the agricultural revival in Ukraine, which I will talk about in a minute. Yes, so it's not just one voice. So the claim that we're making is that damage to Ukrainian farm is not just collateral damage in a war about territorial grains. The Russian military is deliberately targeting farm-related assets and infrastructure. So over time, this has become less controversial as the evidence sort of mounts that these various types of targets are continuing to be destroyed. So, however, this doesn't really explain very much, right? Russia's targeting Ukrainian farms. Sort of this raises just a bunch of new questions. And one of the things that we're hoping to do, what we're doing is putting this current damage in historical perspective. And in order to do so, what I'm suggesting is that we should not just look at Ukraine and Russia as political spaces. They are often thought of as post-Soviet political spaces, and the war is about security and ethnic identity, because that is often the justification for the war, right? That is the Russian justification for the war. However, if we think about agriculture, agriculture happens in a particular ecological space. So what we're trying to do is to sort of look at the area not as only a post-political context, but as the Chernobyl and the Black Earth region. So you may have heard of the Black Earth region. It is a very fertile soil region that stretches across Eurasia, the largest part of the Chernozem is located in Russia. The Russian Federation has 327 million hectares of black earth soil. Kazakhstan has 108 and Ukraine has 34. So the Ukraine is actually the smallest Chernozem country, but two facts are important here. Virtually all of Ukraine is Chernozem, A, and B, Ukraine is also the most southern of the Chernozem countries. So it has long growing season, it has warm weather, and it has ample rainfall, which is less the case for Russia and Kazakhstan. So Ukraine is a sort of the core of the Chernozem. Historically, the Soviet Union and before the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire have laid claim to the Chernozem. So there was a notion of colonialism since Catherine II, that colonialism is taking the land and farming the land for the Tsar. So this is something that dates to the 1800s, but I will not start with 1800, I will start with Lenin and Soviet Union just to not make this presentation too long. Steve.
Your map had a lot of yellow area. What was the yellow?
This is an FAO soil classification thing, so it's basically more drier soil. It's the sort of more arid, the more arid step, I think. So let me talk a little bit about Ukrainian agriculture in the Soviet era, because I think it helps us understand something about what we might think of as Russian motives here. So Lenin won the Bolshevik, Lenin won support for the Bolshevik Revolution with a number of resonant slogans. One was bread to people, and another one was land, peace, and bread. So I'll focus on the bread part here. The bread part was resonant because Imperial Russia at the turn of the century basically had a small urban population and a large rural population, and much of the urban population was in fact suffering from hunger. So there's a famous historian, Nicholas Ryazanovsky, said on the eve of the revolution, the Russian population was divided into two groups, those who were hungry and those who were not. And so bread was a resonant promise. However, the bread problem was not only a political problem, it was actually a very practical, logistical problem. It was actually not that easy to feed the urban population that was hungry, right? And what that entailed was the the Bolshevik government convincing this large mass of peasants to do two things. One is to grow industrial crops, and two, to hand it over to state procurement agents at low cost. The Russian peasants at that time were less interested in doing both these things. They were more interested in either growing for subsistence or selling on the black market, which had much higher prices. So for much of the 20s, this was formulated and thought of as the bread problem, right? And these are the words of Bukharin, who said that the bread question is the most difficult problem of the revolution. And he sort of defined the bread problem as the problem of providing towns with the necessities of life. And this is important because the workers are hungry and because the exchange of goods between town and country is paralyzed. So this was a really interesting sort of logistical problem, but it was also a political problem. And in interesting ways, it was actually also a theoretical problem because it linked into Marxist debates about how to make the Soviet Union a backward country into an industrialized notion. So I won't talk about these theoretical questions, but this was sort of on the minds of the Bolshevik government for much of the 20s. There were two factions in the Bolshevik government about how to solve this vexing bread problem. There was the People's Commissariat for Agriculture. This is basically the agricultural ministers. They were sort of enamored with new methods of doing agriculture, and their solution was to educate the peasants about the benefits of industrial crops and modernized agriculture. And the idea was to sort of tell the peasants about why they shouldn't be backward and religious and self-interested, and they should be interested in the good of the worker state and learn how to do industrial farming. And then they would flock to collective farms because they would understand these benefits. The Ministry of Agriculture was opposed by the Supply Commissariat, the Narkomprod, which was basically the planning arm of the army, the requisition, the provisioning arm of the army, who thought that would just take too long, right? And so the Narkomprod for a long time advocated the benefits of forced requisitions of grain, and then also forced collectivization, right? Because this was about convincing peasants to join collective farms. So you will probably guess that the second group won. In 1929, Stalin ordered that sorry, I don't have my notes. I should have brought my notes, but I've given this talk so many times, right? Stalin ordered the forced spontaneous collectivization, right? So it was basically the order that peasants would have to be forced to join collective. So collectivization is a process that happened between late 29 and 1933 across the Soviet Union. And it was a brutal top-down state-led campaign to force peasants to join collective farms and basically give up all their productive assets. So that included land, any tools they had, and any animals and seeds, any grain they had. So this led in Ukraine to what is known as the Holodomor and famines across the Soviet Union and especially concentrated in Ukraine and Kazakhstan. It was one of the 20th century's most tragic events, and I cannot do justice to it here. I will just sort of mention it, that it had enormous human and ecological costs, and it had between 3.5 and 5 million victims in Ukraine. And I also want to mention that Ukrainian historians have led efforts over the last 15, 20 years to re-examine the history of the Holodomor. So there's excellent new studies on this, if you're interested. The more general point that I want to emphasize here is that the Bolshevik project, the Soviet Union, was a political project. However, if we look at it through the lens of the Holodomor and collectivization, we need to be aware that not only in the 30s, but actually throughout the Soviet period, Soviet political project relied on the control of Ukrainian soil, of Ukrainian farms, and the food that was grown on this Ukrainian farms. And that was largely because Ukraine has very fertile soils, long growing seasons, and favorable climates. And that was very well known, right? And various efforts to make Soviet farms more productive actually focused on Ukraine, right? And so here's Khrushchev with his corn campaign. Khrushchev famously had two reforms to improve the efficiency of Soviet farms. One was the Virgin Lands campaign, which focused on Kazakhstan, and the second one was to bring corn to Ukraine. I won't talk more about Soviet collectivized agriculture, even though I would love to, but I will move on to skip forward a few decades to the 90s and the 2000s, sort of the more recent history of Ukrainian farms. So the question that I actually started out with when I wrote the Soviet and post-Soviet agriculture project was what happened to the collective farms as they were marketized, right? So we have these very large farms that were created in the 30s and that for much of the 20th century adequately fed the Soviet population. However, in the 70s and 80s, the Soviet Union started importing large amounts of grain. So that was sort of the starting point in 1991. What happened to various post-Soviet farms? And this actually looks a little different across all post-Soviet countries. Post-Soviet countries pursued different reforms. I've written a great deal about the variation, and I can tell you more, but for today I will focus on Ukrainian agriculture. So in very, very brief terms, what happened was the 90s were a disaster. largely because Ukraine privatized land. So Ukrainian citizens received land shares, actually Ukrainian rural citizens, so former collective farm workers and pensioners received shares in farms, but they lacked just about everything else that you would need to farm. So they lacked machinery that worked, they lacked capital to update that machinery, they lacked the connections to input suppliers, and they lacked trade access to global markets. So in the 90s, the agricultural, all the agricultural data dipped, and actually I have data on corn that I can show you in a minute. But for a number of reasons, these trends changed quite significantly after 2000. And the reasons are actually related to factors outside of the post-Soviet region, largely for reasons that I won't go into. Investment and global capital investors became quite interested in land as an asset across the world. And post-Soviet farms seemed undervalued. So there's a large amount of capital inflows into a number of post-Soviet farms, and Ukraine was very much a beneficiary of that trend. So with a lot of investment, we see a gradual recovery after 2000, and actually a pretty rapid recovery after about 2010 in terms of production, yields, and export. So I'm mentioning corn here because corn is the quintessential industrial crop, and the corn data has actually sort of driven the Ukrainian agricultural recovery. So agriculture became the fastest growing sector in the Ukrainian economy over the last 10 years. In 2021, agriculture accounted for more than 10% of Ukrainian GDP, 17% of Ukrainian employment, and 41% of exports. So what this looks like in numbers, and I'm sorry, there's a lot of data here, but I think it sort of tells a story in aggregate. So the indices that we have on the left are area, production, yields, fertilizer, exports, and then the last one is share in global trade. So the point is that all of this went up quite radically between 91 and 22.
I mean, a lot of the increase in production is due to increase in sown area for corn, and so presumably that's land that was previously other crops were grown on that land, and corn.
Yes, so there was so but there's actually also a huge increase in the yield.
Yeah, I see. It's both.
So it's both
the extensive and intensive market.
It's both actually, and it's sort of interesting what this actually means. Wheat was quite stagnant, interestingly. So wheat increased in yield, but it's stagnant in sown area.
Okay.
So I can also talk a great length about these things. I actually have a paper about this and wheat. So it's quite interesting that there was actually a shift to corn, but actually all commodities have increased in terms of yields and also fertilizer. And so it's basically more high input agriculture that happens in Ukraine. And so the data that I find particularly interesting is that, Ukraine basically didn't contribute anything to global trade in corn in 2000, right? 0.05%. And now, just before the war, it contributed 14% of global corn. So that is a lot of corn. So Ukraine actually contributed 80% of China's corn imports. So the corn data is just particularly stark, but it's actually also true for wheat and for oilseeds. So a couple of things about this corn boom that I think are interesting. First, it integrates the Ukrainian agricultural sector into global commodity markets, both in terms of investments and in terms of export. So there's actually investments in agricultural Ukrainian agricultural companies from all over the world, including from Western Europe, from Russia, and from China. Chinese state-owned enterprises are heavily invested in agriculture, agricultural infrastructure. So these ports that are now getting bombed were actually paid for by Chinese SOEs. And then in turn, Ukrainian corn is very popular across the world. So Ukraine exports corn to dozens of countries, with China, the EU, Turkey, and Egypt being some of the main importing countries. Here's a map. So this is sort of the global reach of Ukrainian corn. But this is actually grain, I'm sorry, not just corn. The last thing that's interesting is that because of this revival, Ukrainian corn started competing with Russian grain. So Russian grain has also undergone this recovery in the 2000s, but actually a few years earlier than Ukraine. So I'm mentioning wheat exports because the Russian recovery has actually focused mostly on wheat. And this graph is just particularly interesting because it goes back to the 80s when the Soviet Union was a big importer of grain. And in 2010s, Russia emerged as a leading exporter of wheat and is now the leading exporter of wheat. Similarly to Ukraine, actually Russian wheat is exported to many countries, to over 100 countries, and some of the same countries are leading importers. So the interesting thing about Egypt, Turkey, Nigeria, and China these are all populous countries that do not have a lot of arable land. So they're grain dependent countries. And so the bigger story here, taking Ukraine and Russia together, is that actually the Chernobyl once again feeds the world. And that again is because that's what Ukrainian and Russian Russian imperial farms did in the 19th century before the Russian Revolution. Let me see what I can tell you about what this all means for how we understand the war, right? So this is the history of Russia and Ukraine's entangled relationship in the realm of agriculture and food, right? We are used to thinking about the two countries as having entangled history, but we tend to think of it more in sort of cultural and ethnic terms or in security terms, right? That's what the narratives are regarding the war. So what we're trying to figure out is what role does grain play in this war? So the first thing we can say is that the wartime destruction of Ukrainian farms continues a long history of Russia exercising control of Ukrainian farms to further its own political goals. Secondly, of course, the war is not only about grain, but it may just be also about grain. And then what it seems like to us is that Russia is seeking control of the combined Chernobyl food resources originating both in Russia and Ukraine. So I thought I mentioned a couple other things that we're doing at the time. One is research on the adaptation strategies by Ukrainian farms. So there's all this damage together with Vitaly. We conducted interviews with farmers and to find out more about how Ukrainian farmers are actually responding to this damage. And this is sort of in the spirit of not seeing Ukrainian actors as sort of these passive actors receiving damage, but actually responding and trying to adjust. The second thing that we're just starting is a project on the political economy of post-war reconstruction. So I've done a lot of research on what capital inflows mean for these countries, right? Because since the 2000s, all these countries, or actually not all these countries, a number of countries have received global capital investments. Reconstruction will likely also entail capital inflows to Ukraine. So what we're trying to say is that it's really important to understand where these funds go, which type of infrastructure gets rebuilt, which type of farms will benefit from that. So I have slides on both these projects, but I think I will finish for now. Thank you. Yeah, I can answer questions, and Zoom audience questions will be translated by Michael. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So
can you just bring us up to date on land exports of Ukrainian grain and the challenges posed by the different rail gauge, and whether there's more grain getting out by rail than was the case a year ago? And then also, you showed us Kazakhstan and all of its Chernobyl, so should it be concerned? for its territorial integrity?
Yes, great questions. Yeah, so the EU has initially lowered all trade barriers to help Ukrainian grain. Leave via the land routes, right? Via mostly road, train, and then also via sort of the Danube ports. So bring it to Romania and then to Europe. The problem with all of these methods, rivers, rail, and road, is that it's much more expensive, right? Somewhere between sort of 5 and 10 times as expensive. And there's actually sort of bottlenecks at all the roads. There's a scholar I recently met who writes on everyday geopolitics. So she did interviews with truck drivers at these border crossings. So it's just a sort of small part of grain that can leave that way. And actually grain production has fallen by half in 23 to 22. So 22 was actually already worse than 21. I don't know that data exactly, but 23 has been even worse, right? So actually that was Vitaly holding up a corn, and in my first picture is because corn is not even being harvested, right? Because it's so expensive. So some grain is still leaving Ukraine, but just not very much. There's actually sort of a glut of grain in Ukraine, and the prices are so low that farmers are not even bothering to harvest. And then the sort of second, the political part of this is that, as you may have read, is that East European farmers are really upset, right? Because the cheap grain is coming in, and there's sort of the idea that this grain would be funneled through Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary to Baltic ports to then go to world markets, but it's just apparently virtually impossible to control the actual transactions with grain. So that's to your first question. That's sort of where we're at now. The EU is trying its best to kind of keep the status of Ukrainian grain, but there's a lot of political pushback. In terms of Kazakhstan, so Kazakhstan has actually experienced less of a recovery because they're very drought prone. So Kazakhstan has a lot of Chernosem, but with climate change, it's actually much riskier to farm in Kazakhstan. And even in the Soviet time, I did interviews with Kazakh farmers. It was sort of considered sort of a buffer. In bad years, we will also farm in Kazakhstan, and the virgin land expanded the area under cultivation, but has much lower yields and actually much lower investment. So it is sort of less valuable land compared to Ukraine. But nevertheless, there's actually a bunch of Russian agro holdings, agricultural companies that are invested in Kazakhstan. So, Kazakhstan is going more of the sort of, friendly absorption route, seems like. So there's, and I don't know enough about Russian-Kazakh relations, but I think the answer is no. I think they want to work.
What I'm trying to understand is this. So given all the limitations of the infrastructure that you described, there's a certain yield potential in the country. So what percent of the potential are they actually growing in terms of yielding? And because I'm wondering if it's not 100%, is that because they can't sell it or they can't transport it?
Yeah, so great question. So that's actually the question that agronomists have asked about Ukraine for a long time, right? Like the soil climate yield potential is very high, right? And actually one of the reasons why there's been so much investment, but there's actually been sort of problems with infrastructure before the war, and now obviously there's more problems, but more damage to infrastructure. So now the yield potential, the potential for Ukrainian grain is even lower. So basically there's two problems now, is that farmers have reduced acreage, so they're just growing less. They can't get the fertilizer they used to. They don't have some of the machinery, and most important, the Black Sea blockade is actually the most damaging. They cannot get it to world markets, right? And they used to sort of store it, all these storage facilities filled up. There was an aid project from Brazil where they imported these plastic sleeves, which is because the storage facilities were full or destroyed, so they would, fill plastic sleeves with grain. But now it's just sort of, they can't sell it. The storage facilities are full or destroyed. It's very unclear what the future of this safe corridor is. So some Ukrainian grain can leave the Black Sea, but it's so risky that, commercial shipping companies, basically it's too risky and too costly for them. That's related to this question of what's happening to the Black Sea. Russia has naval preponderance, right? Ukraine has quite successfully attacked Ukrainian ships, but Russia still controls enough of the Black Sea to make it really hard for Ukraine to export anything, in particular a bulky commodity like grain. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so from what you said, farmers are not growing as much as they could, even under
Yes.
given circumstances.
Yes, they're growing less than half, actually.
Oh, so the potential is actually twice what?
Well, it depends how you think of as potential. I think potential would be sort of in an ideal post-war reconstructed Ukraine, right, or pre-war Ukraine. So I think given the circumstances, it actually was quite surprising to us. That is actually my slide on the resilience strategies. Actually, it was kind of surprising to us that they do grow some grain. And one of the interesting things about Ukrainian agriculture is that about half the total production is from large farms. And then I'm mostly talking about large farms and the export-oriented farms. There's actually also small farms in Ukraine for interesting historical reasons, which is not the case for Russia and Belarus. And so the small farms have actually kept growing various crops, mostly for the domestic market. Right? So this is a story of export-oriented Ukrainian.
Sound bites to your fine presentation. The
Thank
first one is, I was happy to see the word ecology in your presentation. But there's also another aspect to ecology, and that's the ecological terrorism of Russia. For example, you mentioned the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, and perhaps you can add the militarization of the Zaporozhye nuclear plant. But basically what Russia's doing, that's another effect on Ukraine that's hard to perhaps to mention right now, but should be studied as a potential additional factor. And one interesting thing on the equipment being stolen, which is cited in several different areas. One is that a lot of that Ukrainian equipment was John Deere and high-tech American European equipment, which you could actually turn it off. So when the Russians stole it and brought it back to Russia, the Ukrainians basically turned off
The GPS.
the GPS and the chips. I don't know how it works, but they did, rendering it useless. And another thing that has been recently discovered is this is all because of sanctions and the fact that the Russians, in order to keep their agricultural machine going, need high technology, and now they can't get it anymore. They're actually stealing agriculture equipment in Ireland and England and trying to ship it back to Russia. And there's been cases of the black market and criminals being caught doing that.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was actually a sort of a tangent, a research tangent that I went on a couple of years, was precision agriculture, and it's really quite fascinating because Russia was trying to wean itself from Western technology, but the Russian farmers were like, well, but those GPS outfitted trucks are just so much better and actually save us money because we can have targeted fertilizer. And so it doesn't surprise me that this sort of technological component still remains quite important. If you have any sources, let me know. And then the ecologies, yeah, we're really trying to figure out what's going on here. So one of the interesting things is that environmental activism has played a role in Ukrainian in the Ukrainian independence movement since Chernobyl, or not, if not before, right? So this was about the sort of destructive environmental consequences of the Soviet rule, and the cost of the Kakhovka Dam, Chernobyl, and other elements are sort of part of that movement. And there's actually, as you pointed out, there's now Ukrainian scholars who point to the environmental cost of this war, right? And ask how we can rethink the war, right, as an ecocide. And it came up mostly after the Kakhovka dam. So the agriculture is almost like, so I've been trying to read that literature, and it's often kind of about, endangered species and wildlife and ecologies that are very different from agriculture, right? So agriculture are highly cultivated spaces, right, for particular and so it's a different kind of damage, but it is sort of environmental damage that really affects not just sort of Ukrainian export earnings, but actually it reflects sort of Ukraine as a country and as a sort of in an ecological term. So I'm working with two people to figure out what the Ukrainian discourse is on that side, right? So what I don't want to impose my framing. I want to sort of listen to Ukrainians how they think about these terms.
Could you say a few words about sort of the relationship between this issues you've been discussing here and the sort of geopolitics of sanctions and the stances that different countries have taken on those? Because it seems like, with the exception of the EU, most of those main importers of Ukrainian grain are either neutral or more taking the kind of Russian side.
Yeah.
Of course, they're also importing from Russia as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. So that, I have sort of, I think of this research like as a kaleidoscope. You can like turn the kaleidoscope like a couple degrees and then get a different story. So the geopolitical story is what you're saying, right? Like Brazil, China, and a number of grain importing countries in Africa have been either neutral or supportive of Russia. Turkey is a really interesting case here because Turkey is playing both sides, right? What I'm I think infrastructure is kind of the big deal in the long run, and China has been heavily invested in Ukrainian infrastructure because they actually look to Ukraine as a sort of future for Chinese food security. China is very interested in securing its food sources in the future. So commercially, economically, they can just cut the costs. Like, this is state-owned enterprises, like they don't care about losing a couple billions of dollars that they invested in food infrastructure. But I think in terms of food security, it's not as clear, right? So one of the things that I'm hoping to look at, soon is the state buying board. So a lot of these countries actually have government grain buyers. So Turkey, Egypt, and China have government grain buyers, and I know that some of them have increased their contracts with Russia. I have to, actually devote time to looking at that. So it's a really, it's connected to politics in interesting ways as well. Talk to radiators with blood playing up. Angelina.
Thank you so much. So I'm thinking about food within Ukraine, and it seems from your talk that that's not a concern, at least not for us.
Yeah, so great question. So actually my co-author, Natalia, has done more research on small farms in Ukraine. And she's done research on the impact on small farms versus large farms. And small farms are somewhat less affected because they use less fertilizer. They're not dependent on exports. They don't actually usually have short commodity chains. They're less disrupted. So they are sort of, there's this, actually, do I have this? No, the image of a Ukrainian farmer pulling the tank. I think this is sorry. Yeah, it was at the end. Yeah, so there's this image of Ukrainian farmer, a tractor pulling a tank out of the war. So there's this image of farmers as actually heroes of the war, and one of the reasons is because they actually feed the country, right? So the food security in Ukraine, as I understand, is not threatened by the war, which is good news.
I also love the term political ecology. I don't know, is that, did you come up with it, or?
It's out there.
It's out there.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah,
I will read up on it.
yeah.
I was wondering if you mentioned that the Ukrainian corn and Russian wheat started competing. I was wondering can tell more in what way, because there's different commodities.
Commodities.
Need to be exported to different countries. So that's my first question. And my second question was about, I think your talk gave me a better sense of what's at stake in terms of, whether the conflict will freeze at the current, what is it called, like the contact line. So if it gets frozen the way that it is, what are the implications for Ukrainian grain? So does this mean essentially that, Ukrainian export could not go back to its pre-war potential? And where would the border have to, what would Ukraine have to win to for Ukrainian grain to have vote?
Right, yeah, so the first question about corn and wheat, so Russia produces a lot less corn. Russia has basically invested a lot in wheat. And so the sort of pre-war competition was sort of about, mostly about wheat. Ukraine had also historically grown a lot of wheat, but it was also a displacement of wheat on the Ukrainian countryside. So Ukraine would sell more corn because there's actually higher margins on corn. And so Russia was trying to do more corn, but it actually, this is something that Steve knows about. Russia didn't have all these connections to Western seed suppliers. Really, largely the reason why Ukraine has such high corn yields is because Monsanto supplies the seeds. So it's the story about which commodity and how exactly the competition looks is not as neat as like they're competing for the same thing, right? Like it's sort of a complicated story, but generally they are both exporting to global markets. They're both exporting to the same countries, and it isn't just it's various grain. It's actually barley as well, which is used for it's used for animal feed. It's oil seeds as well. So there's actually multiple commodities involved, and they did compete for the same markets, although they had sort of shifting comparative advantage.
There's one thing you should research, because you said you're going to do this. I wonder whether the Russians are undercutting other global commodity prices and giving special discount deals like they do with oil. And that would be a very interesting thing to find out.
Yeah, so this is definitely something we're working on. They're giving food aid right now because there's sort of outcry about the effects of the war on global food security. I mean, Russia has been subsidizing wheat for, roughly 20 years. So that's also, but, the US is subsidizing wheat as well. And there's sort of grain diplomacy that's going on. So there's definitely a lot of that going on, but I don't have the story tracked down. Sorry, I just want to come back to Janine's second question. Yeah, so if the front line freezes as of today, just the territorial boundary, as well as the balance of power, the security situation in the Black Sea, it would be very, very bad for Ukraine. It's just very dangerous to export corn, and this is, an important sector for about 5 different reasons for Ukraine. So it would not be good. It would make reconstruction really difficult. And there's a lot of Ukrainians are resilient and forward oriented at the current moment, even though it's a crisis. And there's a bunch of talk about reconstruction and post-war recovery, and agriculture is always a big part of that. But it's going to be difficult at the current moment.
I'm curious, does anybody track how much of this grain, let's say, is wasted every year, unsold and wasted?
Since the war or previously?
Well, because I want to know, compared to before the war, is it really, really low at this point, or is a lot wasted?
That's a good question. So, generally there's sort of very high demand for these industrial crops on global market. Since the pandemic, the global prices for these commodities have been quite high. And my sense is that there wasn't that much wasted, right? My sense is that now a lot of grain goes to waste because the really grain cannot reach sort of global market. And there's actually, some countries have domestic value added ways of dealing with the grain, right? You can turn it into ethanol, you can turn it into livestock feed. But Ukraine actually doesn't have that because it's been so easy to export. They've sort of focused on exporting, and Russia has actually the few dairy farms. They have large dairy farms, so dairy farms are a big consumer of grain because they kind of eat a lot of grain. Russia has actually also bombed the dairy farms, systematically. So a lot of this grain is going wasted. Some of it is, just not planted. Some of it is sitting in the field. Do you have a Zoom question? No? Okay. So I should probably add that this is, not a sort of traditional research project where we had a question and then derived answers based on theory and tested our theories. That's not what we did. We were sort of grappling with these like unfolding events and how we could make sense of it. And we have different backgrounds and expertise. And we're writing sort of different types of texts as well. We're writing academic articles, which is ever so frustrating because it takes forever. We're also writing shorter policy pieces and media pieces. So we're kind of making it up as we go with this. But it's also an unfolding story. We don't know. What we're basically hoping to achieve is sort of try to draw attention to this part of the war, this aspect of the war, what it means for the war, how we can find concepts and terms to talk about it, and then also, see how it unfolds.
Thank you so much.
And here you can also email me if you want to get that. Thank you.